Hello everyone, I just wanted to do a quick guide on tanking dungeons. This is everything you should know if you're going to jump into a roulette to tank a dungeon or a trial. So first up, the first thing you do when you join a dungeon is turn on your tank stance if it's not already on. Beyond that, your goal as a tank is to tag every enemy you come into contact with as soon as possible. By tag, I mean hit it with a move. And so our AoE skill for Warrior Overpower is going to be very essential in tanking dungeons. Your first goal is to tag every enemy once, and once you've tagged every enemy once, tag them another time. Hit them twice. Wait until you've tagged every single enemy once before trying to tag every single enemy twice. You tag everything once to gain aggro, and you tag everything twice to hold aggro. So what this looks like in practice: typically, I would recommend to, once you get comfortable with things, is to run through dungeons and look to tag around maybe 6 enemies. So 2 pulls is a good starting point. If you're a tank in dungeon, you are setting the pace, and some people will expect you to move at a slightly faster pace by tagging multiple groups of enemies. So you could start off with like a pull like this, for example. And around this time is when you would use Mitigation. This is Rampart, Vengeance, Shake It Off, Throw of Battle, or Arm's Length. Arm's Length people don't recognize as a mitigation tool, but it is. It inflicts slow on people when trash mobs when they strike you. So if I activate Arm's Length and I watch the debuff bar of enemies, they are getting this slow weapon skill recast time, or weapon skill cast time, recast time, spell cast time, recast time, auto attack delay are increased. Basically, they're doing a lot less damage. So it is a mitigation tool on a 120-second cooldown, and it should be used as such. If you use all of these mitigation tools, Reprisal as well, you stand to increase your survivability significantly. So much so that you can pull wall to wall, as it's called, in many dungeons. There are obvious limitations. Your gear needs to be good. The better your armor gear is on the left and right side here, the more you stand to tank. So if your gear is synced down, you're going to be able to tank a lot of the dungeon, and you should take advantage of that. When you don't have as many mitigations up, don't pull as big, pull smaller. If you do have mitigations up, it's time to make a big pull. If you burn all your mitigation and you still notice your health decreasing, and you don't have a white mage, for instance, for a burst full heal, it is a good time to use your immunity. Immunity does not come up often in dungeons for boss fights, because boss fights are relatively easy as opposed to pulling large sums of trash mobs. So feel free to burn your immunity to stay alive during a large pull. That's what it's there for. For Warrior, for instance, this is Home Game. Every tank has an immunity. For Warrior, for example, Home Game says it doesn't let you fall below 1 HP. For Paladin, Hallowed Ground, you become invincible to damage. When you're taking a dungeon boss, just be aware to face the boss away from your party. So typically this means running through it, and your party coming from the entrance side does not have to position themselves over here because you turned it for them. This also enables the melee DPS to hit the rear of your target. So let's show this again with another example in another dungeon. We're going to pull 3 enemies here. We have all our mitigations up, so we're going to look to pull more. And we've hit a wall here, so we can stop pulling. And we'll finish off these enemies, facing them away from our party, where they would normally be coming from, which is over here, where I came from. Normally you'd burn a mitigation here too, so maybe a reprisal, for example. Reprisal is your shortest cooldown of 60 seconds, so it can be used almost every encounter. When you tank a boss, you want to face it away from your party, just as you would mobs, ideally. If you add spawn that are far away from you, you can use your range tact, as you saw I did just there, to gain aggro on them without moving the boss. If you move the boss, melee DPS have a hard time hitting it. So it's ideally you want to keep the boss as stationary as possible and use your ranged attack to pull enemies that are out of range. And also, when hazards come up, it's your job to pull the boss out of the hazards so that your DPS can get a good angle on it if they are melee DPS, for example, and have that restricted mobility. So your job isn't to keep the boss in the same location on the map. So If the boss moves to me, there's no need to move it back to where it was. Okay, so a very common mistake I see of tanks pulling groups of mobs is to use the ranged attack. It's not actually a good thing to do is use the ranged attack because it starts that 2.3 second recast timer, as you can see for me based on my skill speed. And during that time, I can't tag any more enemies. So the most ideal thing to do is to run into a pack of enemies and bait them into your location to group them and then activate the AoE. It's a much more effective method of pulling than to start with your ranged attack. This isn't a good example to show it here. Actually, it is now. So a bunch of enemies spawn, and now when I have a good angle to use my overpower to hit all 3 of them, I activate it, and then I move on. This one I can use my ranged attack on fine. There's only a single one. But once I go into this next room, perhaps, I'll need to aggro them just by standing next to them. Then when they get grouped up, I can overpower them. So here we go, I have a good overpower angle. Notice I'm not starting the engagement with a ranged attack. It's not something I would recommend doing. Pop mitigations here because we're pulling a lot of enemies, for example. Something I don't really need to do because I'm over leveled for this. But that's why I'm soloing it. It is also important as a tanker to not stand idle. Like, you are the pace setter of the dungeon. It's up to you to be moving, to be pulling, to keep the party going. If you're experiencing what I've heard as a common complaint is DPS is pulling, I'm the tank, I'm supposed to pull, consider what pace you're going at in the dungeon, and perhaps it's too slow. People come into roulettes doing them, you know, daily for months and months, and they want to get through them. And if you're the tank, you'd be considerate to your party to move at a respectable pace, so that they can get through this content and get the rewards they're looking for, the XP they're looking for. If that's the kind of responsibility you're afraid to have, maybe tanking's not for you, but it will take some practice to get up to that point where you can move at a fast pace and keep the party alive. But that's the mark of a good tank, is you know your limits, you're comfortable with what your healer is capable of, you're familiar with what they're capable of at least. You know how much mitigation you need to handle certain size mobs, and so on and so forth. Another good technique is I'll stand behind this rock here to make sure all ranged enemies are forced to come around the rock. Perhaps this rock is not LOS, but if I stand behind this pillar, for instance, all these ranged enemies come around the pillar to come and hit me. This is an effective way to group up mobs that can then be hit for AoE. So I highly recommend this trick to pull mobs that are ranged closer to you. Instead of bringing the melee to you, you can make the ranged, or bring the melee to the ranged enemies, which is another technique. To group them together, you can bring the range to you by breaking their line of sight. I do recommend being very careful with this technique because you are often breaking the line of sight of your healer when you do such an action. So if you do that kind of thing, make sure you're at high enough health so that you can survive. Also, maybe you want your immunity available if, you know, your healer doesn't recognize they're out of line of sight, for example, or they don't have enough time to get to you. Just make sure you have that mitigation or whatever you need to survive until your healer gets the line of sight. When you're fighting bosses, trials, you kind of want to look out for 2 things, Tankbusters and raid-wide AoE. If you have Tankbusters coming your way, it's a good time to use Rampart or your 30% damage reduction ability. Sentinel on Paladin, for example, Vengeance here on Warrior. And maybe additional mitigation you have, like Warrior-specific ones of Thrill of Battle and Shake It Off. These help you take less damage from Tankbusters. Arm's Length does not work typically. The slow debuff does not work on bosses typically, so it's not a mitigation tool like it is on trash mobs. So use this for pulls, but not for bosses. When you expect raid-wide AoE to come out, it's your job to use Reprisal to mitigate that damage a little bit and make the job easier on the healers. The less damage that is outgoing, the less damage that needs to be healed, which means the more time the healers can spend DPSing. So your mitigation plays a role in helping the dungeons get cleared faster. Fast clears mean more commends for you. So it's kind of, you don't really know what's going to be a Tankbuster and what's going to be an AoE, but the game has a kind of a naming convention. It becomes somewhat detectable. Like Breath Wing, this doesn't seem like a single target attack. That was an AoE attack, as you could tell. So that might be something your Reprisal, just by the name of it. I mean, this is kind of a hard game to play, is to know what is going to be a single target attack or what's going to be AoE, but you do the best you can and use the appropriate mitigation for that scenario. When new adds come up in the fight, remember it's important for you to tag them as soon as possible, so that they don't go onto your healer, for example. If you have any regen ability on you, for example, and as soon as you get a tick of heals, anything you haven't tagged is going to run straight at the healer. So it's important you tag things as soon as possible and keep an eye on the health bars of your allies to view if they're getting hit, for example. If someone's getting hit, it means they're either got hit by AoE and it's manageable, or they're tanking a mob that you need to be tanking. If you're interested in seeing some of the tips I've offered through example, here I am in leveling roulette. This first thing I did was turn on tank stance. And I have mitigation up, so I'm going to look for more mobs to pull. My gear is synced down as notified to us by this icon. Looking to tag every enemy once. Probably a good time to activate a mitigation. I will note here that my healer is underleveled, so I will stop pulling right here. And I will also activate another mitigation. All of it, in fact, because my healer is underleveled. And I will note from here on that I should probably pull a little bit smaller for that reason. Checking the health of my team, make sure no one else is getting hit. Use this enemy list. If the icons are red here, it means you have aggro, so you don't need to worry about that enemy. If it's yellow or green, you do not have aggro, then you need to tag that enemy. Note that my healer's MP is a little low here, so maybe I don't want to pull big again. If I notice my party members are not synced down, for instance they're level 42 and 41, it means they're running this dungeon for the XP. So I can, for example, pull additional mobs. They may be looking for full clears. I passed by a mob room right here that had additional mobs, but if I'm feeling generous, I can go out and clear that for them, because they are looking to just kill mobs. They're looking for the experience. If you guys didn't know, you earn more experience when you're doing a duty closer to your level. So I'm level 71 on this Gunbreaker, so I earn pretty insignificant experience from the mobs themselves, as opposed to the level 41s and 42s. They'll earn a lot more. Notice I burned all my mitigation, but I don't need it for anything else. It's all almost off cooldown. I'm facing the boss away from my party, as you can see here. The boss move over to the corner. Unless I'm familiar with the mechanics, there's no reason to move it from here. Okay, my healer died in my attempt to face it away from the party. But you see, this is why you want to keep its conal AoEs away from the party. So I'll go over here and pull these extra mobs because they're looking for full clear. Likely. I only have one mitigation up, so this should be a fine pull here. And maybe even too big, because these ice guys do a lot of damage. And if you die from a big pull, it's a very forgivable offense. You just adjust down. You know, as long as you use your mitigation, you try and you give that honest attempt at the game, you know, it's not a big deal. At the end of my dungeon, my healer notified me that he just started healing today, and we went faster than expected. And my team still commended him. He did a good job, despite my massive pulls. That just goes to show you, if you tank well, your healer, even though they may be uncomfortable with healing, can still have an easy job. If you use your mitigations properly, you shouldn't be taking insane amounts of damage, and things can still move smoothly. Alright guys, I hope that clears up tanking in dungeons. It's been a pleasure. If you have any questions or comments or recommendations to other tanks as well, feel free to leave them in the comments. We're here to help each other. Thanks for watching. If this video helped you, leave it a like and subscribe if you want to see more content from me. Take it easy, guys. Peace.